I used to work at my dad's restaurant when I was in my later teen years. It was just a regular local place, but was open until 2 a.m. every night. During high school, I would only work after school until 8, but once I graduated, I started working the closing shifts to save up money for college. The restaurant would be surprisingly busy at night, all the way up until closing. Mostly it was just people picking up online orders, but sometimes groups of friends would come in and hang out at one of the tables while they ate. I definitely preferred working at night though, as I would be the only one there and didn't have to listen to my dad bossing me around. Anyways, after 6 months of working nights, things started to get pretty weird. It was almost closing, around 1:45 a.m., and I was in the back cleaning when I heard the door ring. I finished up what I was doing and made my way to the front counter. There were 2 young men who looked really tired. One of them came up to the counter while the other one stood at one of the tables. Or dining room, but I can still take a small order if you want it for takeout. The man at the counter just stared at the menu and didn't say anything. I stood there uncomfortably as the man shifted his gaze to behind me as if he was inspecting the place. A few seconds later, the man by the table quickly walked out and the other guy followed. It was definitely the weirdest encounter I'd probably had, and I couldn't really think of any reasonable explanation. I kind of just assumed that they were planning on robbing me, but then decided otherwise for some reason. The next morning I told my dad about it, and he said I could start locking the doors at around 1:45 for the next few days. Another week went by with nothing unusual before it happened again. I had a customer picking up an order around 1:30, and almost as soon as he left, one of the men from last week walked in. It was the one that was standing at the table, and I noticed right away that he was wearing the same exact clothing as last time. However, this time he came up to the counter. He looked me in the eyes for a second, and then asked me if I could help him jump-start his car. The way he said it was really creepy, and it was very obvious that there was something else going on here. "Sorry, I have to stay in the restaurant during my shift." His face immediately shifted into a frown. He said it would only take a minute and no one would know that I left. At this point, I knew something was very off and I started to panic a little bit in my head. He started making his way back to the door, gesturing me to follow him. I honestly wasn't sure what to do and was really freaking out, but my fight response was starting and my adrenaline was pumping. It's worth mentioning that I'm not really that big of a guy at all, and this man was much larger than me. Plus, I was pretty confident that the other guy was nearby too, probably ready to jump me if I didn't comply. But I figured I was screwed either way, so I might as well try to fight. I grabbed a pair of scissors we had behind the counter and stood my ground. The man turned around again once he reached the door, and this time he looked angry and demanded that I followed him. At that same instant, a loud bang came from behind me, followed by the back door slamming open. I ran to the back, and as soon as the guy saw me, he bolted right back outside. I turned around quickly and ran back to the front counter, but the other guy had left as well. I obviously called the police afterwards and gave them the security footage, but it was pretty low quality and hard to make out any identity from them. Anyways, I'm still not really sure why they didn't just attack me and rob the place, but my best guess is that they were just trying to rob the store without harming anyone. So as soon as they saw I was gonna fight, they ran. Those two could have easily taken me down and made the situation much worse, so I'm glad it didn't turn out that way. I lived in a small apartment for most of my 20s, as it was all that I could afford since I lived alone. My complex was small and only had 6 total apartments in it. Most of the people living there were older and retired and kept to themselves. I actually liked the fact that I didn't have to interact with any of them every time that I needed to go in or out to the complex, as I'm usually in a rush or just not in the mood to socialize. Anyways, I lived on the top floor, and the room across from me had an old couple living there for almost 2 years before they moved out. I never talked to them, so I didn't really care, to be honest. But several months go by before someone new moves in, and another 2 weeks went by before I actually met them. I was getting ready for work one morning and preparing my packed lunch when I hear the neighbor's door open. I didn't think much of it until another minute went by and I realized that I never heard the door close. I finished getting ready and put my shoes on, then opened my door to leave. I immediately noticed that the neighbor's door was still open, and a tall man in his 40s or 50s was standing right outside the door facing me. He smiled and introduced himself. I faked a short smile and told him my name, then said I had to go to work and began walking past him. But as I started down the stairs, he asked me to come in for a little bit and have breakfast with him. This was really weird, as I had just told him that I needed to go to work. But I just said sorry and continued down the stairs and out of the complex. While I was at work that day, I thought about how strange the interaction was. Thankfully, when I got back home, I was able to get into my apartment without any interaction. But the next morning, I woke up to a knock at the front door. I was really annoyed because I had work today and now I was up early, but I quickly got dressed and opened the front door. My neighbor was there, but strangely, he was standing right in front of his open door again. He asked me to join him for breakfast again, to which I obviously declined and told him in a more aggressive manner to not knock on my door so early. The man didn't seem very happy about my answer and just kind of stood there. Then he said that I didn't have to leave for work for a while and I had enough time to eat with him. I knew that there was something wrong with this guy, as there was a lot about that response that was creepy. I firmly said no and then backed away and closed my door, making sure to lock it. Again, the more I thought about this guy, the more creepy and disturbing the interactions seemed. The rest of the day went by as usual though, and I got home around 6. I made some dinner and watched a movie, and got ready for bed around 11. I laid in bed for a while, thinking about my creepy neighbor and wondering what to do about it. I decided that if anything else happens, I'd contact the owner of the complex and have him talk to the guy. Then I leaned over and turned off my lamp and tried to fall asleep. But a few minutes later, I heard the neighbor's door creak open. I waited silently, listening to what the guy was doing, but I couldn't hear anything else. Again though, I never heard the door close. I was pretty nervous, unsure of what the man could possibly be doing this late at night. Eventually though, I drifted asleep due to not hearing any further noises for over an hour. I'm not sure how long I slept before a loud knock at the door woke me up. But these knocks didn't come from my front door. They were at my bedroom door. I shot up, completely terrified, and turned on the lights. The only thing I had to defend myself with was a small screwdriver on my nightstand. I grabbed it and stood next to my bed, shaking in fear, before picking up my phone and calling 911. When they arrived at the front door, I quickly got out of my room and opened it. I was surprised the door was even shut, but I told the officers everything and all about my suspicions of the neighbor. Unfortunately though, there was no real evidence of a break-in, and they couldn't do much at all. I knew what I heard was real though, and I did not feel safe in my apartment anymore. I called my sister later that day, and she agreed to let me stay at her place for a few days. Those days went by quicker than I hoped though, and I started driving back to my apartment on Saturday evening. I tried to stay calm, assuring myself that the guy had given up by now and everything would be okay. I pulled into the parking lot and made my way into the building. The sun had just set, though the staircase was dim. Slowly made my way up, trying to stay quiet as to not let my neighbor know that I was coming up. Once I reached the top, I saw his door was closed and I got a big sense of relief as I quickly made my way through my door and locked it behind me. I dropped my bag in the hallway and turned on the lights as I turned the corner into my living room. I jumped back screaming as the man was sitting right on my couch staring at me with a wide, awful smile. I sprinted out of the entire complex and into my car, then called the police again and waited for them in a nearby parking lot. When they arrived about 10 minutes later, we drove up to the complex and they went into the apartment while I waited by my car. Surprisingly, they came out just a minute later with the man in handcuffs. They said he was still sitting on the couch and that they also found the small knife in his pocket. The most disturbing part of this whole situation, though, was that when he was questioned, he admitted to breaking in 3 separate times, and I only knew about the 2 incidents, which meant that at one point he was hiding in my apartment, probably watching me without me even knowing. I have a little Jack Russell dog named Maggie, and she has a lot of energy, so when we go for walks, it's not uncommon for them to spread to the 2-hour mark. This particular day, I got home from work around 5:30, and the sun doesn't usually set until 6:30 or 7. Almost immediately after walking through the door, I put her leash on and quickly changed, and then we headed out. The walk went as usual, as Maggie just took me in whichever direction she wanted to walk in. Things didn't start to take a turn until about an hour in, when the sun was almost fully down, and unfortunately for me, I had walked further than I'd realized. If you take your dog for long walks, you know how easy it is to zone out, especially if your dog rarely stops to sniff. We had walked in a direction I had taken normally, but the particular street I was on was unfamiliar, but I still knew the general direction home. I started to turn around, but Maggie was standing still, and then she began whimpering softly, and that's when I saw it. Through the soft light of the sunset, I could make out a huge coyote staring at us in the middle of the street. It was roughly the size of a golden retriever, with matted fur, and with its mouth partially opened, you could see its disgusting sharp yellow teeth. I knew exactly what it wanted. It picked Maggie up and started walking the opposite direction. I was a bit fearful, but for some reason I thought it would just go away. I didn't know these streets very well, but what I did know was that I had to keep moving. As I quickly continued, Coyote slowly followed, keeping its distance still. But the darker it got, the more scared I became, and after walking down random neighborhood roads in the darkness for a while, I came to the horrifying realization that I was lost. All the turns had messed with my sense of direction, and I had no idea which way to go. Through the darkness, I could now see the glowing eyes of the beast, and could now hear it yipping and howling. As I walked further through the dark neighborhood streets, every few minutes another set of glowing eyes would appear behind me, and even more louder howls. I could tell they were getting closer too. I was absolutely terrified at this point, trying to hold back my tears as I was panicking and fearing for both mine and my dog's life. Every once in a while, I'd pass a streetlight and look behind me, revealing the entire pack walking slowly with their heads down, watching my every move. After almost 45 minutes of being followed, I began tiring, and I knew I was far from the safety of my home. Maggie began whimpering louder too, which made me even more emotional as I knew that she was aware of what may soon happen. The howling and yipping became more frequent, growing louder and closer. I looked back one more time to see all of their eyes staring at me from only 30 to 40 feet away. But suddenly and strangely, they all began to separate, moving to the sides of the road. A few moments later, a small car slowly makes its way between the crowd of coyotes and stops right next to me. A lady rolls down her window and asked me if I needed help. I was so thankful for her and told her to please take me home. There are almost no circumstances in which I would willingly get into a stranger's car, but I really had no other choice. The lady was really nice and seemed terrified for me. I was crying at this point, knowing I had just been moments away from a grueling attack. She kindly dropped me off at my house, which was almost 20 minutes from where she picked me up. I live in a nice neighborhood, one where you don't have to worry about your house being broken into or carjacking. The only growing problem in our neighborhood, and many neighboring ones as well, is coyotes. It's been a few years since this incident happened to me, and as time went on, there became more and more showing up around town, getting bigger and stronger. The public knows to be cautious, especially in parks where there are tons of trees and places for them to make home. Signs were put up letting people know of the popular areas where anywhere between 3 and 20 have been spotted. There have been news stories coming out, such as groups of coyotes leaping over fences and taking small dogs, and larger animals being found torn apart in kids' park. Very sad stories, and some even a little scary. But you never think of coyotes as being an immediate danger until you're being followed in the middle of the night by a pack of the hungry and merciless. About 10 years ago, I worked at a cemetery. The money was good and it was relatively easy. All I really had to do was drive around in my truck and make sure no kids were causing trouble. Every night was exactly the same, and by then I had already gotten used to the creepy nature of the job. After a normal night of work, I got off around 6 a.m. and headed home. I didn't usually go to bed until around 11 or so, and while I was getting ready at 10:30, I got a call from my boss. He asked me if I'd seen anything last night, and I said no because I hadn't. He then told me that a grave had been defaced. I swore I didn't see anything though, especially not some group of kids, which are typically the culprit. Anyways, he asked me if I could come back and help him clean it, and I agreed of course, as I kind of felt like it was my fault. When I got there, I realized I had underestimated how horrible these writings on the grave had been. This was not the usual small writing or anything. There was writing all over the stone, with horrible words and markings. What made it so much worse was that when we were cleaning everything off, I was finally able to read who the person was. I will obviously not say the name for privacy reasons, but it was a child, only 8 years old when he passed away just a few months prior. I was filled with anger and sadness, unlike any I felt before. I mean, who does that to a kid? I stayed with my boss for a bit, as we checked some surveillance footage. This cemetery was huge though, and the only camera we had was on one building where the funerals were held, and it wasn't very big. And again, this was quite a long time ago, and cameras weren't what they are today. We didn't see anyone at all. My boss notified the town's office, as the cemetery is owned and run by the city, and for the next few weeks they had some new guys come out to go on watch with me from dusk to dawn. Those weeks went by without anything happening. Didn't see anyone or find any defaced graves. One of the guys rode around with me while the other one stayed near the entrance. I actually became good friends with my watch partner. We wondered and talked about what the defacer looked like, and after some time it seemed like we'd never get to know. Nothing was really happening anymore, and it kind of seemed like a one and done type of screwed up situation. Eventually, the other watch guards left due to the inactivity, and it was back to just me. Another week went by of nothing, before something happened again. One night, as I had just started my shift and began patrolling, I drove all the way to the back of the cemetery, got out, and began my walk, which I had to start doing to see if any graves had writing or whatnot. As I was getting to about where the kid's grave was, I realized that something was off. I was a couple 100 feet away from the kid's grave, and it was pitch black. Something looked out of place. I stared in that direction for a whole 30 seconds, getting a little creeped out even. And I started walking closer, shining my dim flashlight all around the area. Once I was just 100 feet away, I shined my flashlight again at the kid's grave. The light barely reached that far, and in the dim, boggy darkness, I could see a black figure laying on the ground completely still next to the grave. Obviously, I was horrified. I didn't know if it was a dead body that had been dug up, or a living person trying to hide. I stepped closer, slowly, and once I was maybe 40 or 50 feet away, I almost got a heart attack as the figure jumped up and sprinted into the dark field of graves, completely disappearing in the darkness in just a few seconds. I stood in place, shocked, horrified, and confused. Once I got a hold of myself, I ran back to the truck and radioed for the police. Then I went back over to the kid's grave. I warn you, what I saw was really disturbing. In front of the gravestone was a hole. It wasn't a big hole, nothing done from a shovel, but more like someone's hands. It didn't even go very deep, maybe just a foot. Either way though, someone had tried to dig up this child's grave with their bare hands, and it made me sick. I'm not sure what the person was trying to achieve. Unfortunately, we never figured out who did it, but rest assured it never happened again. The town hired 2 new people permanently, and one of us always kept watch over that grave specifically, while the other 2 scouted the area. The city also had more people on watch throughout the day as well. To this day, that's been by far the worst thing I've seen while doing graveyard work. No ghosts, no creatures, just horrible human beings. I had recently graduated when this occurred a few years ago and was taking full advantage of my summer vacation. I had started working full-time at the high school where I had just completed my studies, since I needed the money for college. My family had asked me to accompany them to my grandparents' home in Virginia, but I had declined because I had already purchased tickets for a concert that was set to take place on the very day we had to depart. I didn't mind staying behind at all. I mean, what 18-year-old doesn't want a house to themselves for a full week? Furthermore, I had no concerns that my neighbors would complain about the parties or cause me any kind of inconvenience because most of them were gone as well. I had a strong desire for some fried chicken that day, which took me out of the house. On my way back, there was an accident on the main road, causing a whole line of traffic. So I had decided to take a shortcut and was relying solely on Google Maps to get me home. I noticed a light turn on as I passed a mechanic shop along the route. It was another car, but this car had only one functional headlight, which was really weird. I distinctly recall finding it really odd that this automobile had abruptly turned on its light as I was passing, and I was even more alarmed when it departed behind me. But I was aware that I have a tendency to be paranoid and that I frequently wonder if someone is watching me and whether they have malicious intentions. I dismissed the idea as a weird coincidence and moved on. I started to stress out as I got closer to my neighborhood and realized that the car was still following me. My fear was increased by the fact that I was low on gas at the moment. I had 2 choices at this point. Either I turn around and drive home while the strange car pursues, or I just drive about and see if it follows or not. Driving around, however, seemed to be a very dangerous alternative, because I wasn't sure what I would do if my car ran out of fuel in the middle of the road, leaving me trapped with this creep. I reasoned that I'd better take a chance in a familiar setting, rather than on the side of a lonely, dusky country road. Once this was decided, I pulled onto my street, felt my heart drop as the car with one headlight turned directly behind me. At this moment, I thought I was doomed. I started pulling into my driveway because there was nothing else I could do. To my absolute horror, they started to follow me up. Now that I think about it, I believe I should have called the police, but at the time I was so engrossed in my own thoughts that the idea never even entered my head. Might have contacted my dad, who would have gotten his rifle if he was home. He and the rest of the family were 12 hours away at the time. Stopped and placed my car in reverse when the car started to follow me up the driveway. They reversed in response, but they also came to a stop at the bottom, thus blocking my way out. Started moving forward again, but everything just kept repeating. I drove, they followed, I reversed, and they blocked my exit, over and over again a couple of times. Finally, I hurriedly pulled further up the driveway and swung my car around to confront them. They had already covered more than half of my driveway by this point. I was afraid, alone, and furious. I opened the car door and stepped out with my small pocket knife firmly in my right hand, and my headlights blazing directly into their face. Because I've always been naturally paranoid, as I've already mentioned, I used to keep a small knife between my seat and the car door. I shouted at them, holding the knife out. I merely hoped that they would be panicked. I think they might have believed I was a girl or weak, or maybe had not expected me to react so aggressively. They backed out of my driveway gradually, and slowly made their way down the street. But then they parked their car by a neighbor's house down the road, and through the darkness, I could see someone get out. It was at this point that I began to think more clearly, and quickly ran inside and called the police. I then went over to the front window, looking out at the dark neighborhood streets, but couldn't see any movement. My adrenaline was fading, and I began to panic even more than I was when I was standing in the driveway. Just then, footsteps were heard running around the outside of my house, followed by a nearby window shaking as they tried to force me open it. I was terrified, losing my mind in the panicked rodent. The man continued to run around the house, testing every door and window, trying to force them open. I knew I kept everything locked, but I was worried we may still find a way to break in. So I ran upstairs and locked myself in the bedroom, then called 911 again to ask for an update. I was thankful to hear that they were in the neighborhood less than a minute away. The man began banging against the front door, yelling for me to open it. 2 cop cars pulled into the driveway just in time though, and surprisingly, the man didn't run or anything. I watched through the windows as they put him in cuffs, then I made my way outside to greet the officers. The guy was trying to convince one of the cops that he wasn't doing anything wrong, but of course the cop wasn't buying it. Anyway, long story short, turned out the man was heavily under the influence of both drugs and alcohol at the time. He never explained what his plans for following me or trying to break into my house were, but considering his state, it couldn't have been good. Luckily, I don't have to worry about seeing him for a long time. I worked at a gas station for a couple years in my mid-30s. I've always had jobs that barely let me scrape by, so working at a gas station wasn't much better or worse than many of my other previous employments. If you've ever worked at or been to a gas station at night, then you know that there's always only one employee. Maybe larger gas stations have multiple, but with my experience it was always only one person. There was never anything to do, so you really only needed a single person, but it definitely made it eerie sometimes while being there alone. I'd stand and look out the window by the counter, seeing only the dim lights by the pumps with a field of darkness behind them. The location of the station I worked at was on the edge of town, a few minutes from any other buildings. We get a lot of traffic from truck drivers and cars that would travel between the cities, which was very common for work in the area. When this happened to me though, it was the beginning of spring and had been raining quite a lot. What's great about when it rains is that most people choose to pay with a card instead of cash, meaning far less people would actually enter the store. It was raining heavily this night, and very few cars were even coming up to fill their tanks. I guess we weren't busy in the daytime either, because all the shelves were fully stocked, leaving me with absolutely nothing to do but sit there and wait for the clock to run down. Past midnight, I was seeing maybe 1 or 2 cars pull up every hour. One man actually came in to pick up a pack of smokes, but that was it. After that, I was fighting hard to stay awake. It wasn't even that I was tired, I was just extremely bored. But then a car rolled into the station, followed by another, and then another. What are the odds, right? I started paying attention, watching through the side window. None of the people got out. They all just stayed in their cars right next to the pumps, keeping their cars running. After a few minutes, I thought I might actually have to go out there and tell them that it's dangerous to leave their cars on next to the pumps. But then a few doors opened and a few people got out. 5 people total exited the cars. They were all men and were wearing thick winter-type jackets. Leaving their cars on still, they began walking up to the door. All of the men made eye contact with me as they entered while I stood at the counter. I'm not gonna try to make myself sound brave or anything, because I was shitting bricks at this point. Just the fact that they left their cars on was a clear enough sign of what was about to happen. One of the men came up to the counter, while the other 4 scattered around the store. "How's your night going, bud?" The man spoke with confidence. I looked around his shoulders, seeing the other men grabbing handfuls of product and shoving them into their backpacks. The confidence they had in what they were doing, not even yelling commands at me or holding me at gunpoint, made me absolutely terrified. Probably more so than if I actually was held at gunpoint. They knew I couldn't do anything, so they didn't even bother to go through the effort of dealing with me. Everything going through my head, I never even answered the man. "We'll be gone in a couple minutes. Everything will be fine," the guy said. One of the other men came up and jumped over the counter. "Open it." I did as he said, letting him take the cash from the register. Being at night though, there was barely anything in there. The guy held up a few dollar bills, showing the man on the other side of the counter. "Where's the rest?" "Don't have any more. My boss makes sure it's empty or we switch shifts." Of course, the man did not look satisfied with that answer. He stared at me for what felt like an entire minute. Then he smiled. "Have a good night, bud." He motioned to the others and they walked back to their cars and drove off. Without hesitation, I called the police. I was almost 100% sure that they were about to hit a nearby gas station in an effort to grab more cash. I alerted them of my concerns, and they sent multiple officers to that location, as well as an officer to mine. Turned out I was right. They did go to the neighboring gas station, but the officers arrived too late. The worker there had been robbed clean and had some mild injuries. From what I heard, he was mostly okay. It's been years since this happened, and thankfully I never saw them again, though I'm unsure if they ever got caught and arrested. I feel really guilty for some reason about that other gas station worker that got hurt, mostly because I didn't get physically harmed in any way. I don't know the full story of what went down at their station, but I feel lucky that it didn't go that way for me. Maybe the worker tried to fight back, or maybe he didn't. I don't know. But sometimes I think it's just best that you accept you're in a bad situation, that there's nothing you can do. I'm a 22-year-old male, and this encounter happened a few months ago. I live in an apartment just outside my college campus. It's a fairly nice, newer apartment building, but the surrounding area is pretty shady. I don't spend any time around there though. I just drive down to my campus and back. I hadn't had any bad experiences before this, so I didn't ever find myself worried about much of anything. It was a Friday, and I'd just gotten back from school. I stayed late to get some extra studying done, though it was around 7 o'clock. I pulled into the small parking lot and headed inside the building. Walking inside, I went up the stairs to my room on the 4th floor and went inside, dropping my school bag right by the shoe rack I kept next to the door. I grabbed a pre-made salad from the fridge and sat on the couch to watch something while I ate. While scrolling through YouTube on the TV, a very loud, sudden thump came from the room below. It wasn't an alarming sound necessarily, but more just surprising and out of nowhere. I listened for a moment and continued with searching for a video to watch. A few minutes later, that same sound came from below me again. Paused the video and sat there, patiently waiting for it to happen again. I was more curious than anything. After a couple minutes, it happened again, but this time it was louder and it even caused the walls to vibrate and shake. It was more obviously someone banging something against a wall, but I didn't know what or why. I waited again, but after a bit of no further sounds, I just continued about my night. I'm not sure how much time passed, but it wasn't too long, maybe 40 or 50 minutes, when I heard a knock by the front door. I was in the kitchen, which was right next to the door, so I knew the knock didn't come from my door, but most likely my neighbor's. Listening more carefully, I could hear a man mumbling something. It sounded like he was having a whole conversation with himself, just whispering and mumbling random sentences. I won't lie, it kind of creeped me out. When the mumbling stopped, I went over to the door and looked out the peephole to see if he was gone. The dude was standing in the dark, right in front of my door. He was looking down at the knob as if contemplating whether or not to try opening it. I backed up, trying to quietly walk back to the couch to grab my phone just in case, but almost immediately, the guy banged on my door. Began mumbling again too, making me believe he was definitely on some hard drugs or something. I took my phone and held it tightly, unsure of what exactly my next move was going to be. I didn't know if he was just some harmless druggie, or if he had worse intention, but I felt fairly safe where I was, so I held off on doing anything. After maybe 30 seconds though, the man banged on my door again, yelling something at me, though it was heavily slurred and unrecognizable. I ran to my bedroom and called the police. I didn't know what he wanted, but the fact that he wasn't leaving made me pretty scared of what he wanted. The operator said they were a few minutes out and asked if I wanted to stay on the line. I told them I was okay and hung up. Just then, the guy outside the door started banging even harder. He was definitely hitting the door with something, as it was too powerful of hits for it just to be his hands. It sounded more like he was trying to break the door down at this point. I grabbed a baseball bat from the corner of my room and prepared to hold my ground as the man continued with his efforts. This went on a while, till I saw the reflection of flashing blue lights outside the window. A minute later, an officer called out something in the stairway, making the man by the door stop. I heard them take the guy down. I opened the front door to talk to the police. There were huge dents and cracks on the front, clearly having been smashed with some sort of hammer or even a crowbar. But what I found out next was extremely tragic and awful. The room below mine had a young lady living in it who was found unconscious due to heavy blows to the head. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to recover and passed away at the hospital. Her front door was wide open with no signs of damage, so it's likely she answered the door unknowing of who was there. After beating the lady, he smashed several holes in the walls of her apartment using a large hammer that they found him holding while arresting him. The guy was heavily under the influence of drugs and alcohol, and apparently told the officers that he was looking for a stash hidden in the walls. There were no signs of anything being hidden in any of the rooms after being searched, so the guy likely just made it up in his head while drugged up. What's terrifying is that he was really close to doing the same thing to me as he did to the lady below me. I feel really bad for her though, probably just being nice and opening the door, no idea that her fate behind it. I worked in the warehouse section of a local grocery store a few years back. It was a really small store, being family owned and everything, so we didn't have many employees. Most of the stocking be done during the day, but me and another guy worked overnights, organized the back room, finished whatever the day shift didn't get done. It was a simple job, and honestly paid well compared to other big-name stores. The only downside was that I would work alone 2 nights a week on my coworker's days off. He did the same on my days off. We both always complained about it, because we'd still have to do the same amount of work, except we'd have to do it by ourselves. This happened on a Friday night, which was my coworker's day off. I clocked in at 10:30 and started rolling out the boxes to stock. I had my headphones in, listening to a podcast. Around 3 hours in, finished the first set of boxes and went into the back to grab more, but I heard a thud echo through the building. I pulled my headphones out and listened. The building made strange noises sometimes, but I'd never heard them that loud before. I went to the front of the store and looked down the aisle, but it seemed to all be normal. One thing to note is that the store locks the entrance doors at night, but the exit doors those automatic ones that swing open when you walk by them from the inside. We always leave these unlocked, allowing you to actually pull them open from the outside. It takes a bit of strength, and it feels like you're breaking the door, but the other stores I used to work at did this same thing too, so I assume it's a regular practice. To be fair, if you weren't a worker, you really would never know that they were unlocked, because a quick pull on the door wouldn't even make it budge. You really have to force it. Anyway, this always made me slightly nervous whenever I'd hear something. Seeing as everything was good though, I went back to work. I was in the aisle in the far left of the store, stocking beverages, when I suddenly saw a figure walk past the aisle. It was in the corner of my eye, so I didn't get a good look, but it was enough to make me jump. I pulled out my headphones again and quickly went to the front, looking down where I thought I saw them walking. They weren't there anymore though. I jogged across the store, looking down each aisle. I was sure I saw someone, but now it was like they disappeared. I even searched the back room and didn't see anything. I wasn't sure if I was just seeing things now, or if it was real. I went back to work, but I was a bit paranoid for the rest of the night, looking around often. I heard a couple more things throughout my shift, checking on them each time, but never finding anything. It wasn't until I talked to my coworker the next night that we decided to check the security cameras. He was technically the overnight manager, so he had access to the security room. We saw nothing unusual for the first hour, but then, around the 1 hour and 20-minute mark, a man could be seen entering through the automatic doors. He was wearing a large jacket and had one hand kept in his pocket the whole time. He walked around the store, sometimes stopping to watch me while I was stocking with my back facing him. It gave me chills watching this guy stare at me without me even knowing. We saw him knock over a box at the 3-hour mark, putting it back quickly and rushing to hide. This was the first sound I heard. After this, took the footage to the police, but there were no identifying features, so it was worthless. Seeing that man stare at me, one hand in his pocket the whole time, was such an eerie feeling that, looking like he was hiding a gun or something, deciding whether or not to do something terrible, or maybe he was waiting for me to catch him first. He never came back, at least, not that I know of. I live with my older brother in a small home just off of a highway. We're both in our mid-20s, working regular jobs, but financially, a lot easier on us to split the rent and live together. Anyway, we don't see each other all that often, because we work opposite shifts. I work the morning shift, and he works overnight. Truthfully, I don't think either of us mind though, because it just feels like we always have our own house when the other is gone. This happened a couple months back, but it still terrifies me. I got home from work around 4 one day and went out with some friends before getting back home by 10. My brother had already left for work, so it was just me. I had work in the morning though, so I didn't have much time to relax before bed. I packed my lunch for tomorrow, then chilled on the couch for just 15 or so minutes, then got in bed. Being pretty tired, I was knocked out in a couple minutes. A few hours later, I woke up, seeing it was 2:30 in the morning. I put my head back on the pillow and closed my eyes, but then I heard my brother come in through the front door. It was way too early for him to be off, but it was around his lunchtime, so I figured he forgot his lunch or something, and I dozed off a minute later. The next day, I woke up and got ready for work. I got my bag together, went to the fridge to get my lunch that I packed yesterday, but it was gone. Right away, I realized my brother had probably taken it last night by accident. I left for work. During my lunch, I just picked up some fast food. When I got back home that day, my brother wasn't home. I wanted to let him know not to take any of the food from the bottom drawer, because that was my lunch stuff. I spent an hour cleaning up the kitchen, making tomorrow's lunch, then took a nap on the couch. When I got up around 8, I could tell that my brother had been back at some point, but had left for work already. I heated up some leftovers for dinner, then watched a movie in my room to kill the time. I fell asleep around my usual time, but woke up again in the middle of the night. The time was just before 3, and I heard the front door close as my brother walked into the house. I tiredly grabbed my phone from the nightstand and texted him to not take my food. I was too lazy to get up and talk because I knew I'd have trouble falling back asleep if I did. I got a text back a few seconds later, but it was just a question mark, like he didn't know what I was saying. I didn't want to explain the whole thing over text if he was going to play dumb, so I slowly got out of bed, then walked over to the door. I opened it and went into the kitchen, but he wasn't there. I then walked out into the living room, and in one of our chairs was a random man wearing ragged clothes and had a crazed look in his eyes. I was standing there, frozen from the shock. On the table in front of him was a bunch of food from our fridge and pantry. The man got up quickly, and that's when I saw him holding something in his hand. I turned around and ran for the front door, but I didn't hear him follow me out. I stood at the end of the driveway, and for some reason called my brother first. I explained the whole thing, and he told me to call the police right away. During my freak out over the phone, I saw the man appear in the front doorway and then slammed the door shut, as if he were keeping me out of my own house. The police came, and the man was still there, waving a knife around, telling them to leave his home. They were able to detain him after a few minutes, but I watched them drag him into the car, and I could say for sure that this man was completely psycho. Apparently, he never planned on leaving the house that time, and said it was his house now. How the man got a key to our house is still unknown, but we made sure to change the locks on the doors soon after. It's pretty easy to assume what he planned to do with that knife, but he probably thought my brother was the only one living there, which was why he entered in the middle of the night. If I hadn't woken up and seen him, my brother probably would have been attacked as soon as he walked through the door after work, and I likely would have suffered the same fate in the morning. My house is on the edge of a small town, having several acres of land surrounding it. It isn't extremely isolated, but the nearest house is a quarter-mile away, so it's definitely not your regular neighborhood home. I chose to live there for that reason, though. Anyway, I had lived there alone for almost 6 years when this happened. It was a normal weekend, and I had no plans at all. I was spending most of my time watching TV or working outside in the garden. Sometime in the afternoon, I was walking through the house and passed by a window when I saw something odd. There was a person walking through the trees far off in the distance. It was technically my property, and I knew they could see my house from there. But what was most odd was the direction they were walking. They were walking toward the back of my house, which led to nothing but a vast woodsy area. I watched by the window as they slowly walked past my backyard and kept going until I lost sight of them in the woods. I didn't care so much that they were on the edge of my property, but it was just a weird thing to see given the location of my house. I went on with my day, looking out the window a few more times to see if he ever came back, but I never saw anything. Later in the night, I sat down to watch a movie in my living room. In the middle of the movie, I began hearing footsteps. They were soft and slow, walking through the leaves outside. I got up quietly and looked out a nearby window. I jumped back, seeing a man just a couple feet from me. After the initial shock, I poked my head up again. He looked like he didn't even notice me at all. He was still walking, slowly making his way across my yard. They looked like the same person I had seen earlier, but it was hard to say for sure. I watched them walk all the way to the other side of my property and go into the trees. It was one of the creepiest things I'd ever seen, especially since he came so close to my house this time. I stayed up a little bit later than usual to make sure he didn't come back, and I was ready to call the police if he did. By 11, I hadn't seen any signs of him at all, so I felt safe enough to get some sleep. I went upstairs and passed out. I don't know exactly what time, but I woke up in the middle of the night to that familiar sound. Footsteps right outside my house. As I got dressed and ran downstairs, the sound stopped. I looked through every window and didn't see anyone. Then I went up to the front door and looked out the peephole. That same man was standing in my driveway, looking up at my house. It was an eerie sight, like he was plotting something. I got my phone and contacted the police, but I knew it would be probably 15 to 20 minutes before they would even be here. When I looked out at the driveway again, the man was gone, and that's when I heard the same footsteps around the side of my house. I waited quietly, hoping he'd just go away, but then there was a sharp, sudden sound from my backyard, followed by absolute silence. I was shaking, standing in the same spot, when the sound of another shot rang through the house. The silence afterward lasted for 15 minutes until the police arrived. When they did, I heard them yelling outside, telling the man to drop the gun and everything. This went on for a few minutes, but eventually the police were able to get the man to comply. There's no clear answer as to what he was doing, and after I told them about what I'd seen earlier, with him walking back and forth through the woods, it only complicated things more. As far as I know, the man was pleading it as a temporary act of insanity. Nobody knows for sure if that's true or not, but I find it hard to believe. I've been working at a warehouse for 4 years now. Compared to others, it's really small. From the outside, you probably would never even guess it was a warehouse. It's owned by a small tech company that only moves its own product, so there isn't a need for a big building. Me and my coworker, Seth, were the two main overnight workers, taking turns on the night shifts, but almost never working together. The night shift worker always had to fly solo. The main job for the overnight guy was to fill out paperwork, like inventory counts and shipment confirmations, so it wasn't really a multiple person job anyway. But one night, while I was filling out these papers in the back room, I heard a knock echo through the front of the building. When I walked to the front, there was a man standing outside the building's main entrance. He had his hands above his eyes, pressing his face against the glass door like he was trying to look inside. I walked closer to the door, and once he noticed me, he moved his face back and knocked again to get my attention. "Open the door," he yelled, grabbing the handle and shaking the door violently. I told him he needed to leave and that the doors were not open to the public. He looked at me through the glass for a moment, then calmly walked away. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but thought it had to be some drunk guy or something. I continued with my work, but on the following night, the same thing happened. I heard the knocks, and the man was back at the entrance doors. He yelled at me again to open the door. I told him that he needed to leave, and if he ever comes back, I would call the cops right away. I think that did it, because he immediately turned around and quickly walked away from the building. The next few weeks, he never showed up. I mentioned him to some of the day workers, but they'd never seen the guy before. Then one night, while I was working the forklift, thought I heard something by the back of the building. It was a thud, I thought, from the outside of the building, but I wanted to be sure. I turned off the lift and walked to the back, but everything looked fine. Nothing had fallen over or was out of place. I walked further down to the far wall, and that's when I noticed the back door. I started wondering if that guy had come back and was at this door instead. Maybe that's what the sound was. This one wasn't glass though, and there were no windows on it, so I had no way of knowing what was on the other side. I checked to make sure it was locked, and it was, but I still had a strange feeling about it. I was tempted to open it and look around, but I knew better than to do that. I went back to work, only to hear that same sound a few minutes later. I checked again, and everything was fine inside, but the more I looked at the back door, the more of this strange feeling I got. Then I got an idea. I hurried back to the main office and decided to ease my mind by checking the security camera on the back of the building. My manager always told me that I should really never do this, but I really felt like I had to. It took me a second to find the right camera footage, but once I did, I saw that same man standing against the back door. He was leaning with his ear pressed against it, probably listening to me and hoping I'd open it. I called the cops, but it was like this guy knew somehow, because as soon as I put the phone down, he walked away. Over the next 2 days, we went through the past 2 weeks of security footage. After the 2 times I saw that guy at the front entrance and told him to leave, he continued to come to the building every single night, leaning up against the back door and listening. It was really creepy seeing this guy was at the building every night without me knowing. We had the cops stand patrol outside the building for a few weeks after this, but the man never showed up again. I don't know what he wanted. I still worry that he's gonna come back. This happened last month while I was still living at my previous condo. It was connected to 3 other units, and I was renting the 4th. I worked from home, and one day at noon while I was taking a break, someone rang my doorbell. I went up and answered, greeting a young lady. She was small and skinny, wearing ripped jeans and a tank top. I looked at her, waiting for her to say why she was here, but after a couple seconds, I just asked. She asked me if I was the only one living here. The way she said it was like she was confused by me being there. I said yes, and she apologized, saying she must have the wrong address. I said not to worry about it and closed the door. I went back to work after that and didn't think much else of it. A few more hours into the day, once I was done working, I went out to the supermarket and got back home around 8. When I entered my condo, I felt like something was off. I didn't know what it was, but I went ahead and put my groceries away and started cooking dinner. A few minutes in, I hear something from one of my bedrooms down the hall. All the doors in the hallway were closed, and I had no idea what the sound was, but I tried to convince myself that it was just my upstairs neighbor. I finished making my food and sat at the small dining table to eat. That's when I heard a door open. It took me a second to realize it was from my condo and not a neighbor's. I stood up and froze, hearing footsteps coming down the hallway from the bedrooms and approaching the kitchen. A second later, a man appeared from the hallway. He didn't say anything. He didn't even look at me. He just walked right past me and over to the front door, opening it and leaving. I was still standing by the table, terrified. I ran to the front door and locked it, and locked myself in a bathroom. I know the man was gone, but I was still scared that he might come back. Luckily he didn't, but police weren't able to gather any information on him. I told them everything I knew, but I only saw him for a moment and he didn't even look at me, so I never got a clear view. We asked the neighbors too, and none of them said they heard or saw anything. What's really scary is that there's no signs of a break-in, so it looks like he had to have some sort of key to get in. I also told the police about the lady that came by and how it was a weird encounter. It may have been a setup for them to scope out the place before entering. I just don't understand why this happened to me. There were a few things missing, but amounting to less than $100 total. Maybe I got home before he had the chance to grab more, but he didn't even have a backpack or anything, and the fact that they must have had a key only had me paranoid even more. I was able to move out, but it's only been a month, so I'm still shaken up. I'll probably have this to think about for the rest of my life, never knowing exactly what happened that day